Many people who live locally associate Barn Elms with the extensive playing fields near to the wetlands centre. But what they don't always realise is that under all that turf and running track lie hundreds of years of rich and fascinating history. But before we look at the history of Barn Elms, let's have a bit of geography. This is a map of the Barnes Peninsula in 1901. Barn Elms was the name of Barnes Manor House, which stood near the river on the east side. Barn Elms Farm, or Home Farm, lies to the north. Barn Elms was also the name of the estate, and it filled the whole of the peninsula. Beverley Brook formed, in part, the southern boundary of Barn Elms estate. One entrance drive to the manor house is now Queen Elizabeth Walk, which leads from the Red Lion to the Wetlands Centre. A second entrance to the house was from a drive which emerged on the Lower Richmond Road on the way to Putney. This entrance leads to the Beverley Brook, and there was a bridge over it, which is now long gone. Once you had crossed the bridge, you followed the line of the river to the house. This entrance survives today as a narrow open space east of Pentlow Street, on the Lower Richmond Road, going towards Putney. But enough of geography and maps. Let's now turn to the history. Barn Elms was Barnes Manor House. The lords of the manor from 925 AD were the Dean and Chapter of St Paul's Cathedral, and Barnes Manor is recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. Because it was a single village manor, it was relatively small, with a population then of about 60 people. But the detail of this talk begins with the Tudors. In 1504, the manor was leased to Sir Henry Wyatt. The estate later passed to Sir Thomas Wyatt, Sir Henry's son, who was a poet and ambassador. It was Thomas who was accused of adultery with Anne Boleyn, but he survived the axe thanks to the intervention of his friend Thomas Cromwell. Sir Thomas had a son, also Thomas, who was born in 1521. He was an English soldier who led an unsuccessful rebellion against Mary Tudor. This led to his execution in 1554 for treason, and from this date the Wyatt family no longer held the estate. They had been there for 50 years. So we are talking about high-ranking people living in Barn Elms, but none so eminent as Sir Francis Walsingham. In 1579, the lease of Barn Elms passed to one of the most important and influential men in Queen Elizabeth's court, her Secretary of State, Administrator, and Spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham would spy on foreigners in London who might present a threat to Elizabeth, and he had men working for him throughout the kingdom and in many of the major cities of Europe. Barn Elms became associated with affairs of state, and councils were held there. This is a drawing of Elizabeth, Burleigh, and Walsingham. The Queen often visited Walsingham at Barn Elms, sometimes with her court, but also privately, as in 1589, when Lord Talbot reported, "This day Her Majesty goeth to Barn Elms, where she is purposed to stay all day tomorrow, being Tuesday, and on Wednesday to return to Whitehall again. While she is there, nothing may be moved but matter of delight and to content her, which is the only cause of her going thither." Mary Queen of Scots had been plotting against Elizabeth for many years. It was Walsingham's spy system that discovered the Babington plot in 1586. It was for this that Mary was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and executed a year later. Walsingham died in 1590, but his widow Ursula continued to live at Barn Elms with her daughter Frances. This is a portrait of Frances Walsingham, Countess of Essex. Frances was the widow of Sir Philip Sidney. After Sidney's death, Frances married Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, in 1590. Hence, she was the Countess of Essex. Devereux and Frances lived at Barn Elms until Devereux's execution in 1601 for attempting a coup against Elizabeth. The Walsinghams vacated Barn Elms a year later, when Ursula, Sir Francis Walsingham's widow, died, and Frances, the Countess of Essex, moved away. After several short tenancies, a new lease was granted in 1635 to John Cartwright, who was a lawyer of Lincoln's Inn. 6 years after Cartwright arrived at Barn Elms, a survey of the estate was made. Although there are no known illustrations of this old manor house, we know from the 1641 survey that it was a substantial building. It had a grand hall and 4 other parlours on the ground floor, all wainscoted. There was a dining room and 8 further chambers above, as well as servants' quarters, offices, and gardens. The house was of brick and timber, and in 1664 it possessed 23 hearths. It was a house on a grand scale. John Cartwright died in 1676 and was succeeded by his grandson Thomas. When Thomas Cartwright came of age, he demolished the old manor house and built another in its stead, which was completed in 1694. This is a drawing of that 1694 house. And it was this house for which we have illustrations. It survived 250 years, although it was much developed later, as we shall see. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the riverside meadows at Barn Elms were a favourite picnic resort for Londoners, who invariably arrived by river. John Evelyn, the diarist, was one such visitor, and so was Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys records several visits to Barn Elms in his diary. On the 26th of May, 1667, Pepys wrote, "I away to my boat, and up with it as far as Barn Elms, reading of Mr. Evelyn's new book, in which I do not find much excess of good matter. I walked the length of the elms, and with great pleasure saw some gallant ladies and people come with their bottles and baskets and chairs and forms, to sup under the trees by the waterside, which was mighty pleasant." And later that summer, in the evening of July the 21st, Pepys and his wife went again to Barn Elms, where they walked by moonshine. On the 17th of January, 1678, Pepys relates in his diary the story of a famous and scandalous duel held in Barnes. The duel, he explained, was between the Duke of Buckingham, with Holmes and Jenkins on one side, and my Lord Shrewsbury, with Talbot and Howard on the other side, and all about my Lady Shrewsbury, who is a whore, and is at this time, and hath for a great while been a whore to the Duke of Buckingham. And so her husband, Shrewsbury, challenged him, Buckingham, and they met yesterday in a close near Barn Elms, and there fought. My Lord Shrewsbury is run through the body, from the right breast through the shoulder, and Talbot all along up one of his arms, and Jenkins killed upon the place, and all the rest in a little measure wounded. This will make the world think that the king hath good counsellors about him, when the Duke of Buckingham, the greatest man about him, is a fellow of no more sobriety than to fight about a whore. The Earl of Shrewsbury was mortally wounded in this duel, and he died 2 months later. Lady Shrewsbury was said to have watched the whole episode, disguised as Buckingham's groom, as in this imagined drawing of the duel at Barn Elms. But after all that excitement, let us return to the house. As we have already learnt, the old building had been demolished and a new Barn Elms built in 1694 by Thomas Cartwright. Soon after this, in 1703, Jacob Tonson, stationer, publisher, and secretary of the Kit Kat Club, took the lease on one of the houses on the Barn Elms estate. Jacob Tonson's Kit Kat Club was an early 18th century club with strong political and literary associations. The first meetings were held at a tavern in the City of London, which was run by an innkeeper called Christopher Cat. He gave his name to the mutton pies known as Kit Kats, from which the name of the club is said to have derived. The club moved to Barn Elms into a room especially built for the purpose in 1703. A room 18 feet high and 40 feet long by 20 feet wide. The club's original object was to promote literature and the fine arts. However, all the members were Whigs and discussed mainly politics. The club members had their portraits painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller. 44 portraits were commissioned at intervals from about 1703 to 1718, and they were hung in the club's room in Tonson's house. The Kit Kat Club members included men from all the major families of the time: Sackville, Marlborough, Montague, Cavendish, as well as other notables, including William Congreve, Sir Robert Walpole, and Sir John Vanbrugh. It was Vanbrugh who is quoted as saying that the Kit Kat Club was the best club that ever met. And this is a photograph of the picture gallery, reconstructed at a later date. The meetings of the Kit Kat Club ceased in about 1720, and Jacob Tonson retired to his country house in Ledbury. He handed over his business to his nephew, on whom he settled the portraits. Kneller's portraits can be seen today in the National Portrait Gallery and at the National Trust's Benningborough Hall in North Yorkshire. In 1774, the last of the Tonson family moved away, and his building was later demolished. We now move on to the Hall family. Their history is a long one, made more confusing by the fact that so many of them were called Richard. The first Sir Richard Hall was born in 1648, and he was the founder of the banking dynasty Hall and Company, which is now the oldest privately owned bank in the UK. Of its earliest 17th century customers were Samuel Peeps and Sir Godfrey Kneller. He didn't live at Barn Elms, but he was the start of the Hall dynasty. However, Sir Richard Hall, born in 1735, did live in Barn Elms, and he held the first baronetcy of Barn Elms from 1786. During his time there, the 1694 house that Cartwright built was extended and modernised. And this is the drawing of that 1694 house. And this is a drawing of the 1772 house that the first baronet built. 2 wings had been added to the original building, along with balustrades and a pediment. The approach from London by way of Putney, the modern photograph we saw earlier, was altered so that the visitor, immediately after crossing the Beverley Brook, passed through an entrance gate with a Gothic-style lodge gatehouse. A formal canal to the west of the house was also enlarged to create a 4-acre lake with a grotto, an island, and a footbridge. But Sir Richard died in 1787, and his son Richard Colthall succeeded him. Sir Richard Colthall, 2nd Baronet, was born at Barn Elms in 1758, and he was brought up there. He was a distinguished artist and archaeologist. He died in 1838. But the Hall family's connections with Barn Elms had already ended in the 1820s, when a bill was presented to Parliament to authorise the construction of a bridge over the Thames at Hammersmith. This bridge was designed to shorten the journey from Richmond to London. However, the plan meant that 6 acres of land were required from the Barn Elms estate on which to build the approach road. The Hall family were unwilling to allow this and forced the Hammersmith Bridge Company to buy the whole estate of some 500 acres. The Act was passed in June 1824, and Hammersmith Bridge was opened on the 6th of October 1827. The approach road that caused so much trouble was then called Upper Bridge Road, but is now Castleknowe. Before Castleknowe was built, the only road leading north in the peninsula was Ferry Lane, which met the Chiswick Ferry. With the sale of land to the Hammersmith Bridge Company, the estate attached to the Barn Elms house was reduced to 120 acres. The Hammersmith Bridge Company had difficulty in selling the rest of the estate, virtually the whole peninsula, and it was subsequently broken up. Some of the riverside land was taken by the West Middlesex Waterworks, and reservoirs were built on the west and northern edges of the peninsula. Further land was let on building leases, and the construction of houses on Castleknowe began in 1842. After the Hall family's departure from Barn Elms, Sir Lancelot Shadwell, lawyer and MP, lived there from 1827, the year the bridge opened. He was of a robust appearance, said to be due to his bathing in the lake every day, whatever the weather. On one occasion, a large party of lawyers, barristers, registrars, solicitors and clerks arrived unexpectedly at Barn Elms to seek an urgent injunction, and Shadwell heard the case while up to his chin in the water. Shadwell had 17 children by his 2 wives. He died at Barn Elms in 1850 and was buried in the churchyard of St Mary's Barns. Thomas Allen painted this view of the rear of Barn Elms with its lake in the 1840s. After Shadwell's death, the house and its 120 acres of grounds passed through several hands before Henry Davis Pochin acquired them in 1870. Pochin was a radical MP, chemist and industrialist. Among other inventions, he devised a process that enabled white soap to be made, when before it was an unpleasant brown colour. In 1852, he had married Agnes, who was a pioneer in the campaign for women's suffrage in Manchester. In 1870, Agnes and Henry Pochin moved south to Barn Elms so that he could travel more easily to the House of Commons. In 1872, Agnes became a member of the Executive Central Committee for Women's Suffrage, and over the next few years, the Central and Manchester committees received large sums of money and support from both Henry and Agnes. Their daughter Laura was also a suffragette, and when Henry bought Bodnant in North Wales in 1874, Laura helped design the gardens there. Bodnant was given to the National Trust by the Pochin family much later, in 1949. Henry Pochin died in 1895 and Agnes in 1908. Her name, along with 58 other women's suffrage supporters, is on the plinth of the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square, which was unveiled in 2018. This photograph shows the Lobjoit family outside Barn Elms farmhouse. The Lobjoits were large-scale market gardeners in Surrey and Middlesex, and they lived at Barn Elms Farm from 1832 until 1895. There they raised English cos lettuce, now known as Lobjoit's cos, which is still grown today. The farm was bought by the West Middlesex Water Company, and in March 1897 the farmhouse, cottage and farmland were drowned to make way for the 4 huge, almost square Barn Elms reservoirs. This is a map showing those reservoirs to the east of Castleknow. But to return to the main house and to the final reincarnation of Barn Elms. In the early 1880s, after the Pochins had left, the house and remaining estate was taken over by the Ranelagh Club. This drawing by Edward Kennard was made about the time the Ranelagh moved to Barn Elms from Ranelagh House in Fulham, and until 1939 Barn Elms was the clubhouse of the Ranelagh Club. The club was essentially a polo club, which by 1894 was the largest polo club in the world, with boxes for 200 ponies. There were 4 polo grounds of excellent quality, with adjoining clubhouses, tea rooms and terraces for spectators. The Polo Club became the first to host a sports match under electric floodlights when it played the Hurlingham Club in 1880. T.F. Dale wrote in 1905 in his book about polo, "I do not think that anyone who visits the Ranelagh for the first time will accuse me of exaggeration if I say that it is quite the best equipped and best managed club of its kind in the world. The situation is incomparable. The beauty of the grounds, the old world character of the house, give a charm to the club, and make it one of the most notable resorts that fashion has ever had. Ranelagh on Saturday afternoons, when some great polo matches are to be played, is one of the most brilliant sights in the world, and certainly one which no foreign visitor should miss, if he wishes to see English society at play and polo at its best." But the Ranelagh Club became more than a polo club. At its height it consisted of the main clubhouse, the Barn Elms House, 10 croquet lawns, 2 tennis courts, an 18-hole golf course, as well as facilities for archery and horse riding. There were 2 lakes for swimming, rowing and fishing. The club also played an important role in the early development of flying. The Royal Aero Club was founded in 1901, and the Ranelagh was their regular ballooning launch venue. This picture from May 1908 shows a ballooning event at Barn Elms, and it's interesting to note that women aeronauts were allowed to be members of the club and were encouraged to fly. The social side of the club was an important aspect of the Ranelagh. There were tea and dinner dances, and on summer evenings the grounds were illuminated with fairy lights and Chinese lanterns. Within the house were innumerable and opulent grand rooms, including a musician's gallery, drawing rooms, a smoking room, and dance floors. The club was described as quite the best equipped and managed of its kind, and one of the most favoured resorts that fashion has ever had. During the Edwardian period, the Ranelagh was a recognised feature of the London social scene, where the elite of London society would drink tea on the South Lawn. Prominent military figures, crowned heads of Europe, and our own royal family attended gatherings such as these. The club had approximately 3,000 members in 1913. This is a painting of the club exterior at that time. This picture shows the inner hall and staircase. And this is the blue dining room in 1931. And this the blue and green drawing room with the winter garden beyond. And this the garden stairs and hall. The club flourished for over half a century and survived the First World War. But as the 20th century progressed, the club's patronage diminished and funds dwindled. The Ranelagh Club at Barn Elms closed on the 30th of April 1939, only a short while before the outbreak of the Second World War. During the war, the house suffered damage when it was requisitioned by the military. Some of the grounds were used for allotments by local Barnes residents under the Dig for Victory scheme. In 1946, the Surrey and London County Councils opened negotiations to purchase the whole estate for use as school playing fields, and compulsory purchase orders were confirmed in 1949. This watercolour shows a derelict Barn Elms with its overgrown gardens in 1952. The house continued to suffer serious deterioration, and Surrey County Council decided to demolish it. However, a serious fire broke out in 1954, leaving Barn Elms little more than a shell. It was then demolished. In 1956, the site was divided into two: the Barn Elms playing fields, now managed by the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames, and the Barn Elms Sports Centre, managed by the London Borough of Wandsworth. The Barn Elms reservoirs became redundant in the late 1980s, and the naturalist Peter Scott decided this would be a good site on which to develop an urban wildfowl reserve. The London Wetland Centre opened in the year 2000. One of the great trees of London remains on the estate site near Queen Elizabeth Walk, and is reputed to be the oldest plane tree in London, dating back to around 1616. It is known as Old Barney. If you go along Queen Elizabeth Walk today, you can see the remains of the lake on your right. The entrance drive to Barn Elms, now Queen Elizabeth Walk, has been extended to the river, and you can then follow the Beverley Brook round to see where the carriageway crossed it from the Putney entrance. And by looking across the playing fields, you can begin to appreciate what a vast site the Barn Elms estate was, even though there is nothing left of the magnificent landscaped gardens. It is a shame that so little remains, but the green open space and the wetland centre are still there, and under all that turf lies the fabulous history, the intrigues and scandals and luxurious aristocratic living that was once Barn Elms Manor House and its estate.